Hi, I'm Rishabh Khandelwal, and today I'll be talking about our work on unpacking privacy labels, a measurement and developers' perspective on Google's data safety section. So, why do we care about privacy labels at all? So, to understand this, we need to go back to privacy policies. Now, privacy policies have been the default choice for notice and consent for a long time. And unfortunately, they are incredibly long and complex, and hardly anybody bothers to read them. So to standardize disclosure of privacy practices, people came up with these privacy labels, which are kind of like nutrition label, but talking about privacy practices. So essentially, they offer a simplified view of an app's data practices. Now here are some examples of privacy labels for Google Play Store and the App Store. App Store adopted privacy labels in 2020, whereas Play Store implemented them in July 2022. Now, prior works have studied privacy labels on App Store in detail. So in this work, we focus primarily on Google's data safety section, or DSS. So in DSS, each privacy practice is described with 4 levels. So as shown in the animation, at the top is a high-level privacy practice, such as data sharing, data collection, and security practices. The next level consists of coarse-grained data categories, such as locations, personal information, etc. Next, we have fine-grained data types, such as emails and addresses. And finally, we have purposes for each data type. Now, our main research objective is to understand how developers experience, as they disclose these practices. So specifically, we formed 3 research questions. How do developers report their privacy practices in DSS? How do these reported practices evolve over time? And what are the driving factors behind the change in DSS? What are the challenges and behaviors of the developers? So before we go into the results, here's a quick overview of the analysis pipeline. So we start with to collect the DSS, we start with the list of app IDs from Androzu. Then we scrape the metadata and DSS using our custom scraper. We use this DSS to understand how privacy practices are reported at scale. We also perform this scraping 10 times over a period of 10 months. So that allows us to study the evolution of DSS over time. Now next, we conduct a developer study where we identify 3 trends from the measurement part above and reach out to the developers, asking them about the trends in the DSS, implicitly probing them about their experience with data safety sections. We then qualitatively code their responses to understand the developer's experience and the challenges that they face. Okay, so here's some details about the dataset. As I mentioned, we took 10 snapshots of 2 million plus apps over 10 months. So we scraped more frequently around July 22, which was the time when the DSS was implemented. So that allowed us to capture developers' immediate response, as well as the long-term response as we scraped later in next year as well. Now finally, we filter apps with low download counts, resulting in a final analysis set with 1.1 million apps. This was scraped in May 23. Now for overall adoption, we see that only 47% of the apps in our set had DSS. This was in May 23, indicating that developers are slow to adopt to the data safety section. We also noticed that popular apps have higher adoption than less popular apps. Okay, so first we discuss the measurement component. Now, looking at reported data practices, we find 3 key themes. First, we see that apps are underreporting data sharing practices in their data safety sections. Now, this could be because it can be hard to understand third-party libraries' privacy practices and what kind of data they collect. The other theme that we saw was over-reporting of practices specifically for purpose. So we see that apps report large number of purposes for data types. For example, this workplace app by Meta, which has over like 10 million downloads, I think. It lists 6 out of 7 allowed purposes for all the data types that they list. Now, this could be either due to lack of expertise or the developer being overly cautious about purposes of third-party libraries. Now, finally, we also noticed internal inconsistencies between the data safety sections and the app metadata. So for instance, we see apps encrypting data in transit, but not collecting or sharing any data. Similarly, we see apps collecting data types that they do not have permissions for, highlighting the inconsistency in the reported practices. We will also explore these trends and possible explanations in our developer studies later. Okay, next, moving on to the evolution of data practices, where we see this chart showing the number of apps with DSS for each snapshot. So we see that the apps with DSS consistently increases over time. However, between each snapshot, there are also apps that remove data safety sections. In fact, we see that 21% of the apps remove data safety section since June 20th when we first started scraping, whereas 40% of the app updated DSS at least once. So there is something going on which forces the developers to change their DSS over time. This indicates that developers are still figuring out the requirements, and even after like 10 months. Now, looking at the evolution of collection and sharing practices, we see two important trends. We notice that apps can change their practice from collection sharing to not collection sharing, and vice versa, quite frequently. Now, this can have serious implications as the trustworthiness of the privacy label can be in question. We uncover some potential causes for these in our developer study. We also observe the consistent pattern in over-reporting practices, particularly purposes over time. This suggests that developers see little risk in over-reporting their data practices. And once again, I think we see this point in the developer study. So let's talk about the developer study. Now, we identify these three key trends in the reported practices from the measurement study above. So the trends are, first, the inconsistency between the data encryption and the collection and sharing practice. And the other two trends are where the apps go from collecting to not collecting and not collecting to collecting. So next, we contacted the top 10K developers with each trend and asked about the observed trend, implicitly probing them about their experience with DSS. This was a simple email where we sent them questions about their DSS, identifying ourselves as researchers. Now, we received 889 valid responses, using which we conducted a thematic analysis. This analysis included random sampling and iterative coding by multiple authors until we reached saturation and generated a codebook. We note that we do not collect any demographic data to avoid potential friction in developers' response. So the thematic analysis revealed the life cycle of updating DSS as experienced by developers. So first, they reduced their intended privacy practice based on their app implementation. Now, while attempting to fill this in the DSS form, they face several challenges. These challenges result in strategies to initially fill out the form and get it accepted. Now, after submitting the initial form, there might be inaccuracies which lead them to update the form. Now, in the next few slides, we'll delve deeper into each of these components. So first, let's discuss the developers' intended practices as it was disclosed to us by them. So for third-party collection, developers mainly use external libraries for ads and analytics, and mostly for ad revenue, which makes sense. Now, regarding encryption, they often report securing data during transmission, sometimes implicitly assuming that third-party libraries will take care of it. This may not be ideal, but at least they're focusing on encryption. Now, for first-party collection, developers do not want to collect data, and they stress on the importance of obtaining user consent, which is again a good sign. So overall, developers primarily use third-party libraries for ad revenues and tend to focus on encryption. Okay, so for challenges, developers reported several challenges while interacting with DSS. So first, they lack detailed information about privacy practices of third-party libraries, making it difficult for them to assess their own privacy practices. They also reported inconsistency in the review process as one of the major challenges, with one developer describing, "We submit the same form, oftentimes Google rejects it, and then eventually they accept it." Some developers also had issues due to language not being their first, English not being their first language. Now, developers also get confused with Google's review process, finding it unclear and the explanations vague. For example, one developer frustratingly noted, "Google told us we are collecting IDs, but we don't use ads or any analytics." So this response is they are clearly not satisfied with the platform's feedback here. They also found DSS to be very complex with too many options, causing a lot of confusion. Finally, they also find constant rule changing challenging, as their apps can fail the checks without there being any material change in the apps. So this is like if the regulation changes or the policies changes of the platform. So to summarize, we find that developers face several challenges and need more support for policy comprehension, data safety section simplification, and handling of third-party libraries. Now let's discuss the various strategies adopted by developers to deal with these challenges. So faced with unclear and complex process, developers start to look for alternate options. For instance, one developer noted, we do not collect any data, everything is stored on their device, but there is no option other than to encrypt or select the encrypt, data is encrypted in transit. Faced with unclear and complex process, developers start to, in some instances, developers also report a change in their attitude, with one suggesting that they will stop updating the app because the hassle is not worth it. Now, this can be particularly concerning as such behavior might result in users having outdated and vulnerable apps. Now, in light of not understanding third-party libraries practices, developers tend to overstate collection practices as well, as we saw earlier in the measurement study. One developer noted, it is safe to declare all possible data collection in data safety sections. This shows that developers see very little risk with over-reporting the data practices. Now, finally, if everything else fails, as a last resort, they just try random permutations and try to get it accepted, which is even worse. Now, we see that developers can try to circumvent the review process by either over-reporting their practices or trying random combinations until the DSS is accepted, indicating that maybe the submission tool is not as usable. Now, next, let's look at major causes of inaccurate labels that causes them to change their DSS over time. So first one is misconception about third-party libraries. For example, one developer notes, our app only collects anonymous analytics through Google Firebase, and hence we do not collect information. So here the developer does not realize that by using third-party libraries, they are collecting and sharing data. And another reason was the residual labels, where if there was a feature update, then the app developers forgot to update their DSS. Now, finally, let's look at the main factors responsible for change in DSS. Now, one of the factors is feature update, as I just mentioned. Another is when they realize that they had an incorrect label after being notified by Google or the platform. Now, developers also reported conducting internal reviews of their policies, which results in change in DSS. Now, this is a particularly good sign as it shows positive intent on their part. Another factor was that they were forced to update DSS by platform. So, for example, in this case, this is the response that they received from the app platform. We detected user data transmitted off device. If your app continues to be non-compliant, your app updates will be rejected. This is essentially forcing them to change their DSS, even though they might not agree with it. Now, finally, update in policies and laws such as GDPR can also lead to changes in DSS. Based on these observations, we also came up with a list of recommendations, but due to time constraints, I'm not able to show them here. Please find the details in the paper, and I'll be happy to take any questions.